The Prophecy. Written and narrated by Althea Little. Chapter 4. Amelia stood in a field she didn't recognize. She looked around frantically, trying to understand where she was. It was dusk, and she could barely see. She spun around when she heard the sound of someone yelling for her to duck. A flash of white light zipped past her, blinding her for a moment. When her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could see that the strange magic had come from a young girl with long hair flowing around her. She wore a white dress. Amelia couldn't see her face, but she knew who the girl was. She had dreamed of her many times. Amelia began to run toward her, determined that this time would be different. This dream would not end like the others. This time she would... A bolt of darkness speared past her, barely missing Amelia. She cried out, wishing it had hit her. Instead, it landed heavy in the girl's chest, throwing her back. "Mom!" she choked out before. "No!" Amelia shot up in her bed, screaming so loud her throat hurt with it. "No!" she sobbed. She refused to wipe away the tears that fell down her cheeks. Her heart ached for the daughter she was destined to lose. No, the daughter she would never have. And in this moment, she wanted to feel the pain, to let the sorrow wash over her and through her. She had spent the week since Osric showed up at the clinic avoiding thoughts of him and the prophecy, as well as avoiding these dreams and the feeling that came along with them. But perhaps she needed to feel them now. She laid back in her bed and sobbed. Once the tears stopped flowing, Amelia dragged herself into her bathing room and drew a bath, adding a few drops of lavender to the water. After undressing, she stepped into the water, sighing as the warmth crept up her body, instantly easing some of the tension that her crying hadn't reached. Once the water reached her neck, she closed her eyes and allowed her head to rest on the back of the tub, hair spilling over the edge. Lavender-scented steam filled the small bathing room, working to relax her nerves while the water eased her stiff, aching muscles. In the weeks since Osric had come to the clinic, Amelia had thrown herself wholeheartedly into work. She took extra shifts and stayed later than usual. She dedicated herself to the residential patients, allowing the junior healers to see the walk-in patients. By the end of the week, dark circles had begun to form under her eyes, and her thought process had become dangerously slow. Yesterday, when Gertrude had caught Amelia napping on her reports, she had thanked her for her dedication to the clinic and promptly ordered her to go home and sleep for a few days. As much as she needed to, Amelia didn't want to sleep. The dream flashed in her mind, and Amelia's nose began to burn. She sank deeper into the tub. She didn't want to think about Osric or the prophecy, but ever since he showed up back in her life, the thoughts had come unbidden. Thoughts raced around her mind at speeds too quick to be discernible. Even if she did allow herself to think about them, she wouldn't know where to start. Amelia groaned and sank fully under the water, letting the tears falling from her eyes wash away. She held her breath for as long as her lungs would allow before coming up and gulping air. "Please," she silently pleaded to the goddess, "release me from this misery." She waited for the pain to go away. When it didn't, she decided to wash up and find some way to make herself useful, even if Gertrude didn't want her at the clinic. She got out of the bath and wrapped herself in a towel. Walking into her room, Amelia noticed that the flower on her nightstand was open, a little slip of paper resting in the middle. She padded over to the nightstand on bare feet, water still dripping down her legs. Amelia unfolded the letter and examined it. It was written in her mother's handwriting. "Millie, don't forget that your father and I are hosting a dinner party tonight. You already RSVP'd, so we will be expecting you at 7. Love, Mom." Amelia closed her eyes. She had forgotten about this dinner party. Her parents hosted dinner parties a few times a year, and usually she found a way out of them. But her mother had backed her into a corner this time. Sighing through her nose, she decided there was nothing for it. She would have to go. Oh well, she thought, one party won't be the end of the world. At least it would give her another distraction from Osric. dear goddess, please, please let the world end." Amelia found herself silently praying to a goddess who did not care for the second time in as many days. There was no doubt in her mind that the goddess was watching. She had said the prophecy, after all. But it was obvious to Amelia that the goddess was not on her side. If she were, Amelia wouldn't be sitting at a dining table with her parents, Osric and his parents, and no one else. Amelia's parents sat at either end of the table, while Amelia sat next to Osric and his parents sat directly across from them. Before dinner, their parents had talked animatedly about everything that had happened over the last few years in the state of Indale. These were old friends who hadn't seen one another in a long while and who missed one another. In stark contrast, Osric and Amelia sat in silence. They both answered questions from the parents and exchanged stilted hellos between one another. Osric had tried to start conversation with her a few times, but she gave short, one-word answers, and eventually they fell into an uncomfortable silence. Amelia had tried not to betray her discomfort, but she was grateful when dinner was finally announced, hoping that having something to do would lessen the awkwardness she felt. In an attempt to avoid making eye contact with anyone at the dinner table, Amelia looked around the room. She hadn't taken dinner in her parents' dining room in a long time. Generally, when she came over, they ate at the small table just off of the kitchen. It was cozy and inviting. This room was elegant and formal. Over the table hung a chandelier with the glowing orbs of light dimmed just enough to cast soft shadows around the room. A room large enough to hold a table for 10 currently shrunk to accommodate the smaller group, and still somehow had room to fit a hutch that was now empty of its fine plates and bowls. Those plates and bowls, along with her parents' finest silverware, were currently on the table, brimming with delicious food. "How do you like the roasted duck, Osric?" Amelia's mother asked. Her eyes were bright, and her mouth was turned up into a smile that showed off her straight white teeth. It was nice to see her mother this way. Her enthusiasm seemed to make the room just a bit brighter. Amelia turned in time to see Osric lower a fork full of food away from his mouth. "It's delicious. Probably some of the best duck I've ever had. And since it's my favorite, I've had a lot. I'd love the recipe, if you're willing to share it." Amelia wondered if he knew how to cook, or if he would ask the redhead that was with him at the clinic to make it for him. Her lips pursed, but she covered it by taking a sip of wine. Her mother preened at the praise. Amelia stabbed a piece of asparagus and shoved it into her mouth. She nearly melted as the asparagus covered in a garlic butter sauce settled on her tongue. It was hard to be angry when the food was so good. "I'm so glad you like it. I wanted tonight's dinner to be perfect. It's been so long since we've all been together like this." She looked back and forth between Amelia and Osric. Sadness dulled her shine. Mrs. Caro, Osric's mom, noticed and squeezed her friend's hand in comfort. "It has been a while, but we're all together now, and the dinner is truly lovely, Petunia. Did I hear there's going to be strawberry rhubarb pie for dessert?" Her mother squeezed back. The smile that returned to her face was less warm, but the gesture from Mrs. Caro did seem to lift her spirits. "There is." As if on cue, the plates on the table floated into the air. In a panic, Amelia finished her last bite and placed her fork on the plate before it raced off toward the kitchen. Oh, her parents were just showing off now. Clean dessert plates and silverware floated in on a phantom wind and landed softly on the table in front of each guest. The pie trailed in dramatically afterward. Amelia half expected a trumpet to announce its arrival. The smell filled the room, and Amelia's mouth watered. This was her favorite summer dessert, and this was the first time she had a chance to eat it in over a year. Everyone took a slice and put it on their plates as the serving tray made its way around the table. Amelia zoned in on her slice of pie, and the voices around her became a distant hum. She would much rather focus on delicious food than the conversations happening at this table, and this pie looked divine. The crust was light brown and flaky, and it covered the beautiful pink filling of the rhubarb and strawberries. She picked up her fork and broke through the pastry, making sure to get a little bit of everything onto her fork. The buttery, tangy, and sweet flavors of the pie all mixed together to create magic in her mouth. Her eyes closed and a soft moan slipped through her lips, ending on a contented sigh. How had she gone so long without this in her life? She was in heaven. And then, when someone to her left cleared their throat, she fell right into hell. Her face probably resembled the color of the pie as she gingerly sat down her fork and dabbed at her mouth with a napkin. She refused to meet anyone's gaze. "This pie is delicious, Mom." She took a sip of wine. "Thank you, dear." The reply caught Amelia off guard, not the words so much as the tone. She didn't sound embarrassed for her daughter or because of her daughter. Instead, she sounded amused? That wasn't like her mom. Looking up, Amelia saw her mom and Mrs. Caro exchanging excited whispers. Her brows furrowed in confusion. What was going on? She looked over to her dad, who was studiously eating his pie, not meeting her gaze. Forgetting her embarrassment, Amelia finally looked over to Osric, who was staring at her intently. He wasn't staring into her eyes, but rather at her mouth. His eyes were slightly heavy-lidded, and he looked as if he were in a trance. Thank the goddess she was already blushing, because the look in his eyes, like he wanted to taste the strawberry and rhubarb from her lips rather than from his plate, made her blush even deeper. Attempting to break the tension, she asked, "Do I have something on my face?" But it came out too low, too breathy, even to her own ears. She felt like she was under some kind of spell, trapped by his piercing blue eyes. "Just a bit of pie," he said, looking for all the world like he would lick it off. What was happening? A giggle from across the table broke the tension between the two of them. Amelia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They both looked over at their mothers, who immediately broke apart and tried to school their features. Amelia wanted to take another bite of that delicious pie, but suddenly the food wasn't sitting well in her stomach. "What are you two giggling about over there?" Her mother took a sip of wine, not meeting her gaze. "Mom? We were just saying that the two of you would make such a handsome couple." Amelia stiffened. Mrs. Caro chimed in. "We haven't seen you both sitting together since you were children. It's nice seeing you together as adults." "We are not together." "I didn't mean it that way, dear." "Your giggles are implying otherwise, Mother," Osric accused. None of the humor or ease from earlier could be found in his voice. He didn't look as stiff as she felt, but he did look uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was going. "Well, I suppose we do still hold hope that one day," Amelia's mom began. Mom? She really regretted eating so much. She should have known the conversation would eventually turn to this topic, but did it have to be during the pie? She would never be able to eat her favorite pie without memories of this conversation. She just hoped it would stop here. Of course, the goddess would not be so kind. Her father interceded, his tone stern. "Amelia, tone." Her parents were kind and loving parents, but they prescribed to the idea that elders should be respected at all times, whether they were right or wrong. "Can we please just change the subject?" Amelia forced out in as natural a tone as she could. Her mom looked as though she wanted to say something, but instead she closed her eyes and sighed, shaking her head. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, a new voice joined the conversation. "No." Everyone looked toward Mr. Caro, whose mouth was now in a thin line. "This evening has been pleasant, and catching up with old friends is always a good way to pass the time. But we cannot pretend that we are not all here for one reason." "Marcus." Mrs. Caro put her hand on her husband's arm. He pulled away from her touch, his eyes darting between Amelia and Osric. "The two of you have been irresponsible for long enough. You are adults. The future of our people is in your hands, and you're treating it as if it's nothing of importance.
doing God's know what with God's know who, when you should be getting married and producing a savior.
Osric sighed a long, suffering sigh. His expression changed to a look of boredom, as if this was nothing new to him. But she could see from his eyes that he had withdrawn into himself. Amelia, on the other hand, was flustered. Her parents had never spoken so bluntly to her before. While her parents demanded the respect of elders, they always showed her the same respect. A ringing filled her ears, and her heart started pounding. Her mind raced, and her vision became blurry at the edges. Of course she knew what they expected of her, of them, but that would never happen. Osric had rejected her years ago. He had said he didn't love her, and never would. Amelia's vision began to swim, and she looked side to side, trying to ground herself. Gods, a child, a savior. She couldn't give her people a savior, and if she couldn't do that, then was she... Amelia? The concerned male voice broke through her panic, and she swiped at her eyes. She stared down at her plate, unseeing. Her breaths were too shallow. Her voice was small and shaky when she said, "You're right, we are adults." She found her anger and held on to it. How dare this man come back into her life after all these years and talk to her, to them, like this? And as adults, it is our God's given right to do whatever we want with whoever we want. That does not mean that we don't care about our people. Everything I have done, everything I have given up, has been for the sake of our people. She could feel the anger bubbling from within her. Her voice rose with every word she uttered, but she could also hear her father's reprimands. These were her elders, and she needed to be respectful, even as anger and pain warred inside of her. Failure, useless, weak. The words swirled around her brain. Amelia could feel Osric staring at her, could feel the heat of his arm as it inched slowly toward her. She pulled back and stood up. "Amelia?" Her mother sounded concerned. She was sure that if she looked, her mother's eyes would reflect that concern. But she didn't take her glare off of Mr. Caro.
"Sit down, Amelia. We are not done with this conversation," her father demanded.
She turned to her father. "As an adult," she said pointedly, "I have the right to determine when I am done with the conversation. I cannot stay here and talk about this while remaining respectful, so I will be leaving now. Thank you for dinner." Every word felt like it was being pushed through a tiny hole in her patience. She was surprised she was able to get any of it out. She turned and walked away, ignoring her mother calling after her in concern, her father in anger. She didn't even look back when she heard Mr. Caro say, "Unbelievable. After all these years, you two are as selfish and irresponsible as ever. You should be ashamed." "Oh, hush," his wife scolded. "If it weren't for your hot-headedness, this would have gone much smoother." Amelia scoffed as she closed the door behind her. Her parents lived in a central part of the village, so she just started walking. She didn't know where she was going or what she would do when she got there, but she hoped it involved a stiff drink and something she could beat the crap out of. That's the end of this chapter. Thank you for listening. If you would like to read the story without narration or would like to follow along, head over to www.wattpad.com/user/Althea_little. New chapters are added every Wednesday, so be sure to hit the subscribe button. And if you like this chapter, give it a thumbs up and consider buying me a coffee, linked in the description. All donations are greatly appreciated. Until next time, stay magical.